What makes a good school? What would you think of? Somebody says, oh, our schools are good. We're in a good school district. Or we're in a good school. You hear it from realtors all the time. Oh, that's a great district. They're good schools over there. Or you tell somebody where you're moving, great schools. Or how are the schools? And when people ask these questions or say these things, you hear the implication that there's a qualitative difference between the education your children are going to get, the academic education they're going to get based on locality. And that somehow it resides in the school or in the district, not in the people who live in the district, not in the children who go into the building, but in the buildings, in the schools, in the teachers, in the school board. And I think that's where a lot of you are getting the idea that turning over your school board is going to make a difference in the quality of the education your kids are getting or in the material that they're teaching because of the term good schools. In this video, I want to challenge your notion of a good school, or rather, I want to challenge the existence of the good school or the good school district. First thing I want you to do is sit down and define it. What's your definition of a good school district? What would that look like? And if you say test scores, remember that a score on a test is only as relevant as the material it's testing. So if the test is testing your child on the 13 principles of Black Lives Matter in the classroom, or all the things wrong with capitalism, or, the 75 ways you can protest your evil government or something like that, then, a good test score doesn't really matter, does it? Or how many different genders there are and how to tell. Or how about the grades? The kids are getting great grades. All these kids go on to good colleges. Well, that's fine if you assume that the colleges are looking for the same things you're looking for in terms of academic prowess. That's fine if you assume that nothing has changed from the time they did the last round of, who went to what college and when your kids will be going. So if you're using external criteria to evaluate whether the school is good, be sure they're actually real, and be sure you are comparing apples to apples. So if your definition is academic excellence, my kid is proficient at reading, writing, math, science, civics, history. They're proficient at it in a way that I would define proficient. I'm saying this as if I'm you. Make sure that's what that means. And in order to do that, you'd have to look at what they're actually teaching, what their priorities are, their being the school. And you would also have to make sure that what they're being tested on is as rigorous or matches what they claim to be teaching and is not some dumbed down, made simple version of what they're teaching in the classroom, or isn't differentiated based on who's receiving the test. You're probably thinking, what, can they do that? Yeah. My kids were taking EOGs. They found out because they did what they were told not to do. You tell a bunch of kids, don't talk with your peers about the test that you had, even after the fact. Don't tell your parents or anybody about your test. Don't discuss it. It's a complete secret. So of course, what was the first thing they did? And sorry, these people don't understand children. They compared and contrasted with each other what kind of questions they had in the test. And it wasn't just about putting the questions in different orders, because that you might think, well, they're going to put them in different orders to prevent cheating. Okay. Well, that would make sense, and it's administered on a computer, by the way. It's not a paper test. They can't just look over. And the computer has little screens, so that's be very difficult to look and see what people are doing. But even so, let's say you mix up the order of the questions, that would provide enough security, wouldn't it? But you can do that electronically, can't you? You don't need to hand out color-coded test booklets or color-coded slips or tickets for them to enter things into the computer. And there would be no need for some students to get one color and some to get another if they're all in the same grade, would there? But that's what they did. And my kids found out that different colors represented different degrees of difficulty on the test. And yet the scores are all calculated. It's like, my kid got a 3 or my kid got a 4. I was like, yeah, but you don't know what they were tested on, do you? It's all secret. How would you know? The answer is you don't. There are lots of ways to close achievement gaps. And one of them is change how we identify them, change how we test people, change how we aggregate and disaggregate the data. But you never thought of that. But you just assumed it was all on the up and up and, they would never do something like that. They do. So now that I've put, the seeds of doubt in your mind as far as what can be on a test, that whether your kid is getting tested in the same way as other kids, whether the definition of a good school is academic rigor or something else, let me add the final question mark. Why do you think you have local control over your school? Why do you think replacing your school board is going to do you any good? You must think that the school board has something to say about either curriculum or, the quality of the teacher training or even the superintendent, because they do hire and fire the superintendent, technically. You probably assume that, we'll just replace the superintendent if we don't like the curriculum. Yeah, let's take a little trip down memory hole lane and revisit Common Core. What was the Common Core, Deb? Well, I'm about to tell you. The Common Core was an initiative to standardize education nationally, so we didn't have alleged wild swings in quality and, the delivery of the education from state to state and even from district to district. The argument was that kids were failing in the United States to compete with students abroad because our standards were too low. And so what we needed to do is to make sure that instructional quality was even across the board. It didn't matter what state you were in. We had to have one set of standards, the Common Core. It was voluntary to adopt. The states were not going to, the federal government cannot mandate that states adopt these things. That's unconstitutional. But what Barack Obama did was he incentivized the states to adopt it by creating, grants and money. It was part of an economic relief package, but the economic relief package had that string attached. Adopt the Common Core and you get the economic relief. So 40 states plus the District of Columbia plus I think 5 territories did sign on. And for the first 2 years, it was already highly politicized because No Child Left Behind had been an abject failure and was tied to money, and people didn't want that again. It was tied to money and tests. So on the left, you had people saying, oh, standardized tests are so unfair and, hurt minorities. And then for reasons unknown. And then you have people on the right saying, Commie Core, and they're going to use this to push communism on us and so forth. And guess what? They were both a little bit right. But because it was politicized, it pushed the people creating, in my opinion, I can't prove this, creating the materials for implementing Common Core, which strangely were not produced for 2 more years after it was adopted. So teachers are like, I got these standards, but I don't have any materials. I don't know how to do this. Like actually go into the classroom and teach to these brand spanking new standards that are radically different than what I'm used to. So they hurried up and they developed materials. People are only too glad to grab onto them because, oh, great, Common Core. And those materials, which are still in use today, even though the Common Core is not really by that name, not in use, they're still using these materials. The materials were... They really did, to a large degree, live up to the name, Commie Core, in the sense that they push collectivism, they push socialism, they are anti-capitalistic. There's a lot of things baked into them when you read between the lines that you could argue are anti-American. Not all of them, but a lot of them, and they are, to say the least, quite dumbed down. And the other thing you need to know about the Common Core is that those general standards were then taught in the teacher education programs so that teachers who are now teaching our schools, even if they're not using the Common Core explicitly still, know how to teach to these kinds of standards. What kinds of standards am I talking about? Well, let's take, for example, an English standard that says, student will be able to identify the main idea in a paragraph and identify the main characters and all these things. You might think, well, what's wrong with that? Well, there's nothing inherently wrong with it, except it's very fact-based. You're reading literature, and whereas a teacher might have taught a novel before and said, let's talk about the themes and the characters' motivations, and let's do a whole novel study and compare and contrast this novel to another novel and look at the writing style. Let's get into the vocabulary and do a whole vocabulary test. No. You won't have time for that. You've got to be able to, first of all, focus on teaching your kids how to identify things that can be tested on a standardized test. Because in order to prove that you are meeting standards, you have to test much more often. And the tests have to be very objective, right? It can't be, one teacher has a short answer, an essay, questions. How are you going to compare that class to another class? How are you going to find out if you're meeting the standards without lots of multiple choice, maybe some short answer, but the short answers have such a clear, like what color was George Washington's white horse? And you write white or something. I mean, they're very, very specific. On the other hand, math became a thing where, teaching kids how to do computation and do multiplication tables and all those kinds of things took a back seat to the procedure that they wanted you to use to get the answer. And it wasn't about whether you got the right answer or not. It's did you understand conceptually how to, this subject so that you could follow their little procedure. And you really didn't understand conceptually either. It's just, that's when the new math started coming home with these grids and parents were like, why don't you just carry the two? What's happening? Why don't you just do long division? What is this? And if the kid went in and did it your way, they would get marked off. So that's when that began. They started teaching to tests even more than No Child Left Behind. Things you probably noticed, like why all multiple choice tests? Why am I not seeing any books come home? Where did your textbooks go? And why are you on a Chromebook all the time? Well, that got started in the Common Core. That's 2009. That's how far back we're going. So what happens when you have a top-down set of standards? Do you think that the people running that at the state level and so forth, especially if there's money coming in from the federal government because you're doing things according to frameworks and standards and equity plans and all that was Obama. Do you think you're going to cede that control and give it back to the locality, give it back to the local school board? Do you think the local school board can change any of that? When your state says this is our framework, this is our curriculum, this is what we're doing, do they get to choose? No. At most, maybe your state can choose the materials that you will use to implement the curriculum that meets those standards. But the standards are the standards are the standards, and that's what it is. And so your school being a good school or not a good school no longer depends upon your local control of choosing all the things, whether it's teachers, curriculum, books, standards. No, that's much farther out of your hands. That is at the state level now. And to a certain degree at the federal level, because now every state has to have an equity plan. That's per federal regulation. So in addition to Title I and Title IX and all of these different things that are coming from the federal government, now you've got the old Common Core standards, which even if you're not, again, like I said, even if you're not adopting them, they just keep changing what they're going to call it. So right now, after COVID, you had something called ARPA relief, which ARPA is now being incentivized. You're incentivized to implement social emotional learning. Get a big pile of money to do social emotional learning. Well, that's certainly going to steer your curriculum choices, isn't it? You don't want to turn down that giant pot of money because then maybe your constituents, at the state level are going to say, why did you turn down that federal money? That was for something that sounded good. Social emotional learning. Why aren't we doing that? Why did we turn down, $100 billion? What? It wouldn't be that much. It'd probably be more like, 20 billion or something for the state. But the point is local control, if it ever really was very strong, which is debatable, was gone. Absolutely gone. The only thing your school board now can control is they hire and fire the superintendent. But in order to fire the superintendent, you have to demonstrate like scandal, malfeasance, fraud, some kind of misconduct, or that they are not implementing the state standards, because that by statute, they're required to do that. So if you try to fire a superintendent because you don't like that he or she is implementing those state standards, that's equivalent to firing them, because you don't like their politics. You can't do that. The state board may slap you. They may, in fact, take away your right to have a local school board. That has happened because you're now asking a superintendent to violate the law. And if your argument, like I said, is we don't like the politics of this curriculum, well, we don't like the politics of the superintendent because he's implementing the curriculum, because generally speaking, they tend to agree with it. You're basically firing someone because you don't like their politics. And you may have good reason. And I might stand right behind you saying, like, I don't like them either. But that's not how things are done in America. You wouldn't want it in reverse, would you? If it was Ron DeSantis and you had a state, set of standards that were pro-American or, were individualistic in nature and so forth and so on, if that was the way that Florida was able to go, which again, they'd be hard pressed to do because they wouldn't get federal money. But if that's what they wanted to do, and you hired a superintendent who was implementing that, and the majority of the people in the locale said, we want to get rid of the superintendent because we don't like this curriculum, good luck. You wouldn't want that either. You wouldn't want them to be able to do that. So it's assumed that because you elected your governor and your state legislators, who then choose the state board of ed members, it is assumed you've had your democratic say in education, and whatever they set as the standards and whatever they choose to be, filtered on down to your local school district is okay with you. So how different do you think your school district is going to be anymore from the not so good school district? Or do you think they're going to be pretty much the same? And remember, the teachers too, to get certification, they have to be certified to teach to those standards. They have to be able to implement exactly what the state says they have to implement. And I'm not going to tell you there aren't, levels of quality within individuals as far as how they present that material. But if your definition of a good school is a certain kind of academic rigor, or certain kinds of material is presented well, or a certain level of proficiency will be achieved at a certain time, that may have nothing to do with what the teachers are trained to do. And they may have nothing to do with the standards as they're written. And you may be operating, using a model in your head that doesn't comport with reality because the priorities of the school are not your priorities. And so once again, it's back in the hands of, the parents and the students. But then you have this problem. Whereas in the past, maybe you might have agreed with what the standards were, or, so your child going to school and studying hard and doing well on a test or doing what the teacher tells them to do produces an A that you can feel good about because that A means they know things you think they should know. Now, two things are in play. One, grade inflation, so that A may not actually reflect a level of academic rigor that that you think it does. And the material they're getting an A on, the material they just learned and they can demonstrate that they know, is not stuff you really want them to be proficient at. And because the school has spent so much time on that material, they have neglected the material you were hoping they would learn. So they get an A for activists, but not necessarily an A for analyzing literature or doing math. And if you think that the standardized tests at the end of the year ought to tell the tale, they've changed those too. They've modified those two to match the curriculum. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? Why would they have academically rigorous tests testing things they aren't teaching? And why would the testing companies want to be delivering tests that show up failure all the time? They would lose their contract pretty quickly. So they work hand in glove with all the stakeholders who create the curriculum, and it's fairly incestuous. So they're going to test on what the teachers are teaching, so that 80th percentile or 90th percentile does not indicate that your child is proficient at math or reading. And in fact, if it's 80th percentile, you should be doubly concerned, because whatever it is they're proficient at, they're not even that proficient at. Okay? So I'm going to show you a couple of examples, and hopefully you will see why I say this. Okay, I'm doing some research on a district in California. And the specific district, which is supposedly a great district, median home price $2.5 million in the district. This is a white collar district. This is a district that has a minority population. It's like a teeny tiny percentage of the population. They are very progressive. They have a diverse political range, but still it's California, so very progressive. These are people who have at least one parent in the household is probably pretty good at math because they're high earners. They work in tech. Demographically and every other thing, they fit the stereotypical mold of what you would expect to be a good school district, a desirable district. That's why the properties are so expensive. These $2.5 million homes might have 2 bedrooms. So typical good district, right? So I go to their website to find out more about the district, and I want to find out what they're teaching. What are their standards? What makes them the good district? But guess where I end up? Within like 2 clicks I end up in the California Department of Education website. This is where I end up. If I want to know how the board, what they do, et cetera, for the school board of the district, I'm directed to the state because that's how it works. So I've been trying to tell people every time I make a video and people still aren't listening. So you have things called curriculum frameworks. So here they sort of all are, right? Well, let's click on all. And now we get to the different ones: English, health, et cetera, and so forth. So you can see that this was adopted. This is 2014. Okay, all curriculum frameworks. And we can click on the ELA. Here they all are, by the way. This is the ELA framework by chapter. They have different chapters. And you can see, overview of standards, key consideration, literacy and English language, content and pedagogy. But let's just take a look at this access and equity one. Because remember I told you about equity? And these go through all the grades. You can go look at these. But let's take a look at this English Language Arts Development Framework. And I'm going to kind of fast forward. But here's what I want you to see. Circles of implementation, literacy, whatever. So we're talking about reading, writing, speaking, and language in all disciplines, effective expression, meaning making, blah, blah. It looks very complicated and serious, right? Like, wow, these people are experts. They know what they're doing. So we keep going. And then we get down to California's diversity. Oh, right. Here, let's talk about this. Standard English learners. Standard English learners, SELs, are native speakers of English who are ethnic minority students, e.g. African American, American Indian, Southeast Asian American, Mexican American, Native Pacific Islander, and whose mastery of the standard English language privileged in schools, not standardized in schools, not the language that we standardize in education so that all of our students can go out and function in the world of career and college and whatever, because we're all effectively speaking the same language in those environs. So not standardized in schools, but privileged in schools, is limited because they use an ethnic-specific non-standard dialect of English in their homes and communities and use standard English in limited ways in those communities. And then they have research to show how they know this, okay? The term standard English is used to identify one variety of English among many. The American Heritage Dictionary defines standard English as the variety of English that is generally acknowledged as the model for the speech and writing of educated speakers, especially when contrasted with speech varieties that are limited to or characteristic of a certain region or social group. So then isn't it interesting that instead of, educated speakers, they're calling it privileged? Why? Why not standardized? However, this is why. However, it's important to note that there's no universal definition for SE, perhaps because SE is highly elastic and variable with inconvenient ambiguities that are inherent in the term blah, blah, word salad, blah, blah. From a linguistic perspective, the ethnic-specific dialects of English that SELs from different communities use is equally legitimate as and not subordinate to standard English. Therefore, the dialects of English that SELs use should not be viewed as improper or incorrect English, and teachers should acknowledge them as valid and valuable varieties of English useful for interacting with home communities as well as in the classroom. He even says here that they need to do it in the classroom. It is important that while teachers inform themselves about particular aspects of their students' backgrounds, each population is a heterogeneous group. Therefore, teachers should know their students as individuals. Now, imagine you're a teacher, okay? Imagine as a teacher that you have to go in and implement the ELA curriculum with this as your standard. Instead of taking a subtractive approach, teachers should give clear messages that non-standard varieties of English that students may speak or hear in their home communities are equally as valid as standard English. Do you think they can grade a paper that someone has written in non-standard English any less well than the one that's written in standard English? Do you think perhaps that has an impact on what you might define as a good school? Would you think that's a good school? Because here's what that means is that they don't know and they can't play favorites who speaks non-standard at home and who's just picked it up. So they don't correct the grammar for anyone. They don't correct the spelling for anyone because they certainly can't say, let me ask you, are you guys socioeconomically challenged? So I need to know so I can grade your paper. And you wouldn't want them to, would you? You would want your students treated the same. But that means even if you don't use non-standard English at home, if your kid wants to write in some kind of weird textese or some other kind of non-standard English they're learning from their peers, they can, and it will not be corrected. Still think it's a good school? This is California. This is all of California. So this district with the expensive homes and the people who have fancy jobs and think they've moved themselves into a good district is using this same exact framework. Same framework. No different. No different. Why would it be different? Same with math. If we went back and checked the math framework, which is being redone as we speak, by the way, and that's a whole other video. But you'll find words like equity, you'll find words like cultural relevance and so on and so forth from the State Board of Education. Here's some health curriculum that they use in California schools. What if you don't have time or money to buy sex toys? Cucumbers, carrots, and bananas with the peel make great dildos. Just remember to use a condom. They're using this as young as 8th grade. That's in California. Let's go over to North Carolina, my home state. North Carolina schools allow children to change their name and sex without parental consent. So it doesn't matter if you're in Wake County schools where it's, like really good schools, or you're in like Myers Park here in the Charlotte area. Same principle applies. What's the difference? How about this? This conference, this is going on with the, race, diversity, equity, inclusion, liberate, our voice, our time. This is something going on in California. Reimagine teaching and learning. And then when you look at the schedule of classes, preparing our students for a non-obvious future and jobs that won't exist, educating for the green economy. These are teacher education. Teacher education. Okay. A better way to cultivate equity-focused teachers. So how about that good school district? How about mathematics in context? This is Learning for Justice. Used to be Teaching for Tolerance. They use this all over the country. In districts all over this country, quote unquote, good ones, bad ones, doesn't matter. Mathematics in context, the pedagogy of liberation. Social justice education isn't limited to humanities courses. Too, math educators explain how their commitment to equity informs the way they teach. So teachers can go out and get fully formed, classroom resources, lessons, lesson plans, student text. This is free. So teachers that have a framework, as they have in California, New York, and Washington State, Oregon, New Jersey, even, states like North Carolina, when you have this framework from the state level, the teachers, there's not like a specific textbook necessarily. The teacher's free to go over and grab something from Learning for Justice to implement their non-standard English, blah, 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 affirming this or that, or to make sure they're doing equity math properly. How is your district going to say good when this is going on? And when your local school board doesn't control any of this, this is not up to your school board, guys. This is up to the classroom teacher, the superintendent, whose job is just to implement those state standards. So he or she's just going to go, is it following the state standards? Teachers are going to go, says here, equity in math, got to make sure I have equity in math, and I'm being welcoming and inclusive to the students and focusing on social justice. Yep, that's good. We're doing it. What exactly is your complaint to the school board? School boards are going to go, I don't know, they're doing their jobs. Problem is, you didn't know what their job was. And that's why I made this video. You need to accept that the jobs you thought you understood in public schooling, even in private schooling for that matter, aren't what you thought they were. The incentives you thought they had to listen to you and do what you want don't exist anymore because it's now happening at the state level, not the local level. The voice you thought you had, you don't, because of the way these things have been standardized. Test scores don't mean what you thought they meant. None of it means what you thought it meant. So like I said, sit down tonight and define what a good school is for you and your kids. Because if it doesn't correlate with what I just showed you, you might have a problem that you need to fix. So that's the video. I hope you will consider subscribing to the channel because I do produce content like this pretty frequently, not every day, but multiple times a week. And I want you to be able to get notified when I do, because I hope that it's relevant to your understanding of education in America and to helping your kids get a better education. Please join me in my locals community at thereasonwelearn.locals.com. Like, share, and comment on this video. And that's the video. Have a great day.